Hey there, I'm Douglas Ferguson, and today I'm with Elise Keith from Lucid Meetings. I'm really excited to have you, Elise.
I'm happy to be here. Always fun to talk.
Yeah, for sure. So we were just kind of getting revved up here in the pre-show moment, and I love the topic you threw out, which was social influence and these kinds of I don't know, just ruts or redundant kind of flows that we get into with the way we run meetings or just the way we work, and just the pressure to kind of, I don't know, just to kind of check in and check out. It's just like, we're almost like the hamster wheel, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we draw a picture like when we start working with clients on transforming their meeting culture, this big pit, and and the big pit. There's a ladder getting out of the pit, and there are a bunch of people who maybe know how to run great meetings in any organization. Like they know they're supposed to have um, clarity about why they're in the room, and they're supposed to take notes and get everybody involved. These are not secrets, right? This is not the problem. The problem is when they go to meet, everybody in their organization is kind of wandering around at the bottom of this pit. So you kind of leave your skills on the side and you go down to where everybody's operating. And there's a moment where you have to work together and make an agreement that says, hey, guess what? We are all going to climb out of this together.
Mm.
We're all going to actually do the things that many of us know we ought to do. Okay, come on. And then you can start having the conversation. Then you can start building better practices. But you have to, stop digging.
You know,
And that's
you,
hard.
you said a couple things that are a couple of words that kind of jumped out to me. One was agreement, and the other one was together. And I think where I see a lot of these efforts fail is where, someone's like, I've had enough. Like we gotta fix these meetings, right? And then like they're like they're on a solo mission to, like, they're like, there's always going to be agendas or whatever their
Yeah,
main focus
cut
is.
off 15 minutes at the end. No meetings
Yeah,
on
yeah.
Fridays. Yeah, no recurring meetings. Whatever.
But the thing they miss is they don't sit down and unpack it together, to use your word.
Mm-hmm.
They don't develop agreements together, and they certainly don't like go and attack it together. And I think if more companies did that, they would see more transformative change. They'd see bolder outcomes.
Well, it's amazing how simple the changes really are, but how incredibly difficult they are to
Mm,
implement. Um, but when you step back from it and you look at it, really, it's very much like any other team sport, right? So somebody walks in and they say, "Okay, we're gonna play rugby today," but they fail to see if anybody else in the room wants to play rugby.
mm.
It doesn't work so well. That 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 clarity that this is now the rules of the game. You are all players. Let's work together. Is something that you really absolutely need the rest of the players on the team involved if you're going to succeed.
Yeah, and to take that analogy further, it's like, are we are our meetings where we, on the, I would say on the upper pro end of, we've got it really dialed in. It's like we know what game we're playing, we know what positions everyone's playing. It's a pro team, and it's like a pro league, and people show up
Right.
because like this thing is like scheduled. We know it's a double header. We know who's playing what positions. We know who's starting, who's gonna come in, halfway, or we got some plays marked down, and we thought about it ahead of time and were prepared to execute all the
We got
way
a sense of
down
where the
to,
goal is. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
right. Like, how do we even score? Like, what does success look like?
Yes.
All the way down to, like, I think where a lot of companies are operating, which like brings us back to like like being in elementary school where we're just on the playground making up a game. I've got a stick, you've got a rock. Like what do we? How do we rub these together and like just
Well,
invent
and
something on the fly?
look at all the companies that talk about like we can't get any of people engaged in our meetings, right?
Mm,
Well, if your kid's on the playground playing with your stick ball and making the game up, and you've got the kind of other kids sort of standing around on the sides, which you do, treating it like a spectator sport. One of the ways in which you get them engaged is you make how to play clear so that they
hmm
can join. And that means you have to talk about it out loud. You got to make those agreements, right? So that, that's that social pressure, that social permission to come together and meet well is, I think, so much more important to get in place than all of the nuances about exactly what technique you might use or how to do agendas or any of the rest of it, all of which help and all of which matter, but without the agreement you can't use it.
That's right. And I think starting with some of those fundamentals where we get the team like really aligned and really kind of synchronized on like, well, why do we need to do this work, and kind of what does it look like from a conceptual level, not on a strategic level, and then we can start layering in skills and tactics, right?
Right. Well, and a lot of the skills and tactics that we learn, all the techniques, the liberating structures or the design thinking or whatnot, they're often like crayons. We need the outline, we need the picture, but then we can color it in all kinds of fabulous ways, and you can switch
Mm,
them out. You don't necessarily need to adopt any particular methodology to have success. What you need is a clear vision of success, right? Which is, I think, actually a really important thing to keep in mind as we start making the switch to hybrid work, right? Future of
mm,
work things. And we're coming back, and so much advice is coming out right now about explicit techniques that people should be applying. Whereas the boundaries of the agreements that work in any one context aren't necessarily as clear.
right. And I want to come back to something you were saying in the pre-show chat around it's not about the skills gap. People voraciously consume all these kind of tips and tricks and top 10 lists and stuff, and they want to build up more skills. And yet that's not the thing holding teams back, and you threw out, the permission gap. And I think that's really kind of an interesting lens to kind of think about this.
Yeah. Um, it I know in my workshops that I run with teams, and I've got to imagine you see similar things. Like there is a moment where you invite someone in explicitly,
Mm,
like, hey, can you, would you, will you? And there's that pause and that hesitation, and then a crossing over into the space and into the role. That is such a powerful moment. But when we work with people and in our workshop settings, we can touch, a fraction of the teams involved. So if you are looking at changing whole cultures and whole teams, you know, creating those pauses and those moments and those doorways for people to have that permission to walk in to the space and make a difference, is such a powerful gift, but
mm.
a really challenging one to make sure it gets sent around.
Yeah, it's like I often will talk to people that are looking for advice or want coaching, and one of the most common things I hear is that I've got this certification and I've studied this and I got this training here, but I've got a big meeting with the executive that I'm supposed to lead with. The CEO is going to be there, and and you could just tell by the way they're talking and the expressions on their face, they're frightened to death about this session. And it's pretty phenomenal, that it just comes back to the practice and how do they get to a point where they understand the moves they can make and what works in their context. Because to your point earlier, you can learn all these things about, and people can talk about all these rules and moves for hybrid, but if there are certain constraints or certain policies and maybe existing agreements in place, you got to account for those.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of making that actionable then for people who might be listening to us today, the absolutely learn the skills, right? Come to the practice sessions, come to the workshops. You run public events, I run public events. There are all kinds of opportunities to learn the skills, which absolutely helps with confidence and with your ability to design effective meetings. But don't spend all your time there. Instead, bring them to your team and have that conversation, the conversation of, hey, if we were going to run the best possible meetings for us, what might we do differently, right? Here are some things I've learned. Can we try it? Let's experiment. Let's go ahead and do this in a way that works for us, that's productive, that's enjoyable, that saves us time. Would that work for you? And get out loud, explicit permission. Invoke all of those self-consistency principles, right? Have people say out loud what they want, and that gives you the permission to make it happen.
Yeah, I always like to tell people, anytime you can turn the tools inward, it's gonna be good, right? Like, be willing to have that meta conversation around, because when we stop and we dissect what's going on, that's when we can like break out of the hamster wheel and start to think about the moves we're making. And maybe there's some, like, my favorite thing to talk about in the magical meetings workshop is, what meetings should we cancel?
Mm-hmm. Right. And people know, right? Like you make a list and people absolutely know. They're just waiting for you to ask.
Yep. And, these could be some of the most provocative conversations you have at work, actually talking about how we work. And, it's funny, people complain about the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that there's many versions of this that are dysfunctional. And the reason they're dysfunctional is because the intention isn't to work on the meetings. But if you come in and have an intentional meeting about the meeting, that's your actual goal, it can be
right.
very amazing. And that's what Elise is talking about. That's what we often do. And I always chuckle when I hear people say, oh, not another meeting about meeting. And I'm like, well, that's actually what more people need to do, but let's be intentional about it and designerly.
Well, and I think if you, you can reframe it, right? Reframe it in your head in the way that, like, say, special ops teams do, or pro sports teams do, right? So a pro sports team has met and practiced before they ever get on the field. And even when they're on the field, there will be stops of play where they can meet. And every time that you watch them huddle or take a timeout, that's what that is. To go, hey, how are we playing here? And how might we play better to achieve our goals faster? And what they are talking about is their way of working. They're not talking about, the grand theories of what the game might be about. They're not, necessarily, they're strategizing on how do they work together to achieve their goals faster. And in the military and special ops teams, or in like wildland fire rescue, as they're working to battle wildfires, they stop and they review, action review, right? This is how are we doing? What just happened? What did we learn? How do we move it forward? If you want your team to work better together, stop and go, how are we working? What did we learn? What can we do to make it better forward? They don't have to be huge, long meetings. It doesn't have to be onerous. The first one, make the agreement and then work the agreement, makes it so much faster. And the rate at which you can improve your practice is pretty astounding once you agree to do it.
Yeah, I love that. And, I often hear from folks saying, wow, it sounds like what you're telling me is we need to do a lot more planning for our meetings. And my answer is always, well, just make it proportional to the value of the meeting or the potential risk of things going poorly. What's the business impact of this meeting? Can you invest 5 minutes? And it compounds. You invest 5 minutes to make this meeting better today, and then you learn a few things, and then you invest another 5 minutes before the next time you do it, and then it builds and builds and builds. And to your point, the after action stuff, it's like we learn a lot by just taking a moment to reflect and to go, what could we have done different?
Well, and the thing about what you just talked about, right? Because people are terrified that if they're going to stop and do meetings well, that it's going to add all of this extra time, and they ain't nobody got time for that, right? Like they're way too busy. They've got way higher priorities in play. But unlike some of the other activities where you have to repeat that planning every single time, with meetings, there are only so many so many different types of meetings each team really needs to run. Right. So a project team needs to know how to run a great kickoff and how to run a great status meeting and how to run a good action review, maybe a client demo. So you've got 4 or 5 things that you do a really solid outline design for once, right? So you spend 2 hours one time, and that then liberates and improves the quality of hundreds of hours of invested people time going forward. Because you can use that design and, swap in the players, swap in the project, but the general outline of that design is going to carry you for a long time. Those military action reviews, they don't like sit down and go, okay, let's redesign how we're going to run an action review today. They run the same process over and over again and maybe tweak it. But that design work up front is super reusable. It's a hugely valuable investment. There's very little that you can invest in your company that you get the higher return for than a solid meeting design.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Awesome. Well, that takes us to our time. We're a little bit over. So I want to say thank you, Elise, for joining me. It's been fun chatting about everything from after action reports to skills gaps and a little bit of hybrid. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.